All right, so everything's ready now. And I'm going to speak with you today about a topic that's really just a one-off topic, and it kind of returns to themes that we have talked about together before, but it has been many years. I went back and looked at my notes. Last time we talked about this was in 2018, and the research has actually advanced in important ways since then. It was actually advancing while we were speaking about it, and I think the new research has some important implications. So let me just spend a moment trying to put this in context. And so recently we've spoken together about the issue of the rapid and uncontrolled circulation of disinformation, the contagion of conspiracy theory in contemporary American politics, and in particular, the social structures that are apparently, if not responsible, at least encourage people to be more susceptible to disinformation, to believing stuff that in fact has little or no basis in fact. And obviously, the idea that the election was stolen is the one we were concentrating on, as well as the question of whether or not, in circumstances in which 30 to 40% of the people in the United States believe that the election was stolen, and a substantial subportion of them believe that violence might therefore be justified to overturn the outcomes of that election. How do you conduct a trial if the former president Donald Trump is in fact held by the Department of Justice to likely have violated the law? How do you have that trial without deeply politicizing the criminal justice system, the administration of justice, the rule of law in the United States, right? So that's just to refresh your memory about the complex of problems we were thinking about. And one of the aspects of this I referred to as a deep feeling structure, a sense that something isn't right in the United States in the 21st century, and that mainstream political and social institutions are not paying enough attention to what has gone wrong. And that the sense that something has gone wrong, that there's no simple, direct, easy, popular explanation for it, then gives rise to a susceptibility to conspiracy theory thinking like that, reflected in the QAnon online conspiracy theory. So, with all of that as background, then one of the questions is, if as I suggested to you when we spoke about this a couple weeks ago, if what you need to do ultimately to address this issue is to create a fairer structure of opportunity in the United States in the 21st century, in order to address not just disinformation, but its root cause in people's perception that something is wrong. And that we can then put a more precise label on that, that what used to be a country in which working class and middle class people could have decent economic opportunity and mobility and ultimately security for themselves and their children has stopped being the case in the 21st century. And that as opposed to that, 50% of the population is experiencing downward mobility as opposed to upward mobility, uh, and that there's very little likelihood of intergenerational economic improvement, that we need to do something about the underlying roots of the feeling structure that makes people want to believe that there's a simple, easy explanation for why the American political system has become unresponsive to their needs. Why not make the political system more responsive to their needs and interests? And so, in jumping off from that, I want to drill down on this idea of a geography of opportunity. And the core idea here is where you live matters for all kinds of issues in terms of your social fate. And so one way this is often put is that geography is destiny, and it's not just economic opportunity. A whole range of social factors, factors to do with opportunity, class, race, gender, sexuality, and other axes of differentiation, distribution, and hierarchy seem to be geographically organized. And so that's where I want to focus today. How our study and understanding of this has advanced, let's say, over the last 5 years. And I'm going to start then 5 years ago. And with the publication of a book that 4 years ago I was speaking with you about, Richard Florida, a social geographer at New York University and one of the leaders in this field, and his 2017 book, the New Urban Crisis, and the way in which Florida presented issues to do with a geography of opportunity. And Richard Florida, who had done path-breaking work on the knowledge economy a decade ago, and the way in which the new factors to do with the importance of information, creativity, networking for the creation of wealth in a post-industrial economy made location matter less. I'm sorry, more and not less. That the previous speculation on this topic had been that as we were able to untether from the workplace, do what we're doing right now and communicate over the computer, as knowledge became more important to economic productivity, and as knowledge became ubiquitously available via the internet, the World Wide Web, digital technology, people could work from anywhere. And so the central city would lose its economic centrality. And that seemed actually to happen for maybe the last 20 years of the 20th century, but then things reversed radically in the first 20 years of the 21st century. And Florida helped us to understand why things reversed. And this idea that actually in the new knowledge economy, the ability to connect with people who had similar ideas, who could help you to develop your enterprise, to concentrate in one place, a high density of information workers. You can think here at the San Francisco Bay Area, right, in Silicon Valley, and how much of a leg up they've had because of the way in which they've been a magnet for this kind of worker, that this actually became more important with the information revolution. And this led Florida to identify what he called a new urban crisis, which was not the crisis of the last third of the 20th century, which was a crisis of deindustrialization, moving away of jobs, concentration of urban poverty. That is still, as we will see, and continuing and unremedied crisis. But in addition to that, there's a new crisis, which is that as these cities, they're called by Florida superstar cities, and New York and Boston, Washington, D.C., Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles topped the list in this country as these cities became places of concentrated economic opportunity. Their cost of living rose extravagantly, and it priced people out, including people who had previously been in these communities for multiple generations. Intact African American and Latino communities got subject to gentrification, people got priced out, and the new urban crisis then was a crisis of access, right? A crisis of the ability to be able to get to where the jobs are. And not everybody is going to be a knowledge economy superstar, but if the people who work in the knowledge economy, given the distribution of income in the United States, have a high concentration of income and wealth, and if they want to spend it, it means that that money is going to uh, spread outwards in the geographic area where they live. If you can work in a restaurant or service industry or be support staff, even if you don't have the educational background to be directly contributing to the knowledge economy, you can do quite well if you can get close enough to where all that economic activity is. But there's a vast shortage of affordable housing in places like San Francisco, New York, Boston, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. And so the result is that there's this new urban crisis, a crisis of access to economic opportunity. That's where we will focus today, but I also want to emphasize the way in which things have moved on from Florida's analysis. And so the fundamental framework that Florida introduces suggests that inequality cannot be explained without geography, and that's the jumping off place for this lecture. And whereas Florida's analysis was still primarily focused on the city, right? Can you make it to those 6 cities of opportunity or get close enough to them so that you can gain access to the economic opportunities? The new studies, and they use very much the same kind of technology that Florida was using, geographic information systems, which are very complex ways of integrating data into spatial or geographic representations. What does the economic opportunity look like in Chicago as opposed to in Indianapolis, right? And so Florida was taking all of the data available, mapping it onto detailed maps, and creating an image of economic opportunity that was mapped across urban areas in the United States. What differs now is that we can look not just at Chicago versus Indianapolis, but neighborhoods within Chicago. And that's, I think, really important and really going to have profound policy implications. So Florida, in his analysis, suggested that we have 3 classes of workers in the United States today, obviously broad categories: the creative, the working, and the service classes. And the creative are these new economic elites. They work in technology, they work in marketing, and they are often very well compensated, very wealthy. The old working class has fewer and fewer jobs, fewer economic opportunities. If they have those opportunities, it tends to be in new as opposed to old industrial jobs. And then the service sector has really taken off. The people who provide economic or material or social services to the rest of us, right? And the idea that in particular, service sector workers need to be able to gain access to creative workers in order to really flourish economically, or at least have the opportunities that come with proximity to a lot of income and wealth. And this means that in this new economy, urbanized knowledge capitalism and place and class are mutually reinforcing. You're either where the action is or you're left out. And when Florida did this analysis, and I want to point out that some of the new findings actually call into question Florida's findings. He suggested first that there's a gap between superstar cities and the rest. And so those are those 6 cities, and that they were really where income and wealth creation was happening in the United States. What we see now with more fine-grained analysis of economic opportunity is that there are other factors. And so please note, right, that Florida's analysis tends to be narrowly economic. Where is income and wealth being created? And the newer studies of the geography of opportunity tend to pay attention to other factors, especially the quality of your social network. I'll get into this in more detail in a moment, but that includes both the habits and values of the people with whom you're socially connected, right? Are they, quote, strivers? Are they people who are seeking economic opportunity or not? And second of all, how many people in your social network actually have meaningful economic opportunity, have high income or wealth. And one of the really interesting findings here is that even if you're not in a superstar city, even if your access to economic opportunity is thwarted geographically, if your social network contains people with upward economic mobility in it, you yourself are much more likely to experience economic mobility. So the gap between superstar cities and the rest, which was one of Florida's central findings, may not be as important a variable as he had initially thought based on the data he had available 4 or 5 years ago. The crisis of success within superstar cities, the idea here being that as more and more people are getting priced out and further away, they are having to commute long distances or experience social dislocation, having to move away from the neighborhood that contains their sources of social support, and that the result has been this polarization of opportunity in these wealthy American cities. Disappearing middle, right? So just again, polarization, crises of the suburbs and crisis of urbanization in the developing world. The suburbs where people had moved to in the last third of the 20th century for economic opportunity, good schools, greater space, that has in fact moved in the other direction with this new urban revival or renaissance. And many suburbs, in fact, are experiencing high rates of crime, high rates of poverty, high rates of drug addiction, decline in school quality. I won't speak about urbanization in the developing world much today, other than to say that on Florida's analysis, it's completely distinct. It's not the same as urbanization in the developed world. So then looking a little bit more into the main findings of this earlier analysis, Florida suggests that information capitalism, the phase of capitalism that we are in today, rewards what he calls clustering and geographically concentrated advantage, right? And so if you have a high concentration of creative workers, there tends to be cross pollination and a multiplication of their potential for wealth creation. Whereas if you don't, then your disadvantage is amplified. And I put post-COVID America into the title of this lecture because I think one of the things that has happened, and so I think part of what I want to say to you today is that we have better information than Florida was working with. And it's an indication of how quickly the kinds of data that people like Richard Florida, and I'm going to focus also on an economist, Raj Chetty at Harvard, who I've mentioned to you before, the power of the data and the power of the computing that they are able to do with this data is changing very quickly, right? And so that's part of why, in certain respects, Florida's analysis, if it hasn't been superseded, at least is being significantly revised. But the other issue here is that, of course, in the intervening 5 years, we've had a international pandemic. And the pandemic has also influenced these factors. In particular, during the first 2 years of the pandemic, many of the knowledge sector industries sent their workers home, right? Whether it's Google or Facebook or Apple or Microsoft, they basically said, don't come to work. And the results has been that their workers have dispersed and that there are some new possibilities being detected in the post-COVID economy for networking without being in the same location, right? And so the advantage that the clustering of knowledge economy workers creates has to do with their ability to share ideas in a spontaneous and unstructured way. And so the fact that they can not just go to work, but meet in a cafe, go out for drinks, go on a hike together. And while they're doing that, share ideas with each other and potentially identify areas of innovation or competitive advantage, that has contributed to the power of these new super cities. But having said that, it appears that some of this can actually be done in a technological network as opposed to a geographic network. And so maybe in the post-COVID world, the superstar cities will be less important, though they still will clearly have an advantage. And then within the cities, right, Florida was already identifying, and this is what we'll really see with Chetty's work, that there are patchworks, right? That it's not just the case that the city as a whole concentrates income, wealth, knowledge workers, but there are specific areas in the city. So then looking at Florida's policy recommendations, and we'll see that there's still a lot of overlap between what Florida was recommending and what the new recommendations are. The recommendations here, he called them 7 pillars for an urbanism for all, reform zoning and building codes to create clustering for all. And this is, right, I think so important. I've spoken with you about this fairly recently, that 75% of neighborhoods neighborhoods in urban America are zoned for single family homes on relatively large plots of lands. And that just excludes automatically middle and low income housing, mixed income housing as well, from large swaths of urban America. And so if economic opportunity is in urban America, we want all Americans to be able to move to it, to access it, to have equal opportunity. We have to break down the barriers to creating affordable housing. Density, promotion, infrastructure investments, and right, mass transportation is, I think, the single most important here, but also subsidizing the creation of apartments and other high density forms of living, allowing people to move with convenience and affordability to where the jobs are, either as a permanent geographic location or on a daily basis with things like high speed light rail. Obviously, the ability to plan and implement this kind of infrastructure has really bogged down in the United States. And we've got to hope with the recently passed infrastructure bill, some of this will get better. Affordable housing in central locations, right? Again, this requires public support, public private partnerships like we have in some cities right now, but also just returning to the mid 20th century model of the federal government funding the construction of affordable housing where opportunity is. Increasing income from service sector jobs is related to this, and right, the way to do this is complicated. And on the other hand, there's a very straightforward first step: raise the minimum wage and actually have the minimum wage indexed to inflation, as, for instance, the Social Security payments are, with an annual cost of living adjustment, so that the jobs that are uh, working in conjunction with the knowledge sector jobs don't get left out of the new wealth creation. Investing in people and places to tackle poverty, we'll get to this in greater detail later in the lecture, but that a neighborhood-based approach to opportunity creating public policy, as opposed to looking at the individual or looking at a particular institution, for instance, schools, we really have to focus on the overall quality of the neighborhood. So finally, and again, I'm not going to delve into the international dimension today, empowering urban communities, creating greater structures for inclusion in decision making. We have to be careful here because, of course, not in my backyard, so-called NIMBY ideas have been very destructive in terms of keeping affordable housing, multi-family housing units from being constructed where opportunity is. But having said that, allowing the people who live in a neighborhood to have greater power over it is one of the ways to begin addressing this new urban crisis. Now, I again still looking over the older research. I'm just going to refresh your memory with Robert Putnam's earlier book, the book that was published in 2016, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. And what Putnam did, among other things, was to demonstrate statistically and geographically the degree of economic segregation that has taken hold in the United States. And so this diagram here, right, shows you the number of Americans in 1970 between the two black lines living in middle income neighborhoods. And as you can see, it was roughly 60% of Americans. And as we get into the 21st century, into the 2009 period, you can see that the number of people living in affluent and high income areas and poor and low income areas has gone up to now be 60% of the population, and the number of people living in middle income areas has contracted to be 40%. So a 50% decrease in Americans living in mixed income neighborhoods. And what you can see here, this is Port Clinton, Ohio, where Robert Putnam grew up. And when he grew up, or in recently it's the 1990s, the vast majority of this area was mixed income. And then if you look at it in 2008 to 2012, you've got these large swaths, right? The dark areas, which are high concentrations of urban poverty, and then these little islands of affluence that have completely segregated themselves from the at-risk children. We'll see as we get further into this that living in wealth segregated areas, high concentrations of wealth, high concentrations of poverty, fundamentally shapes the kind of social network you can build. The people who are living in the middle income areas, the large number of Americans in the 1970s, the smaller number in the current period, are, even if they are of not particularly affluent families, the children of poor families, able to make friends who are middle income or affluent. And those networks turn out to be highly correlative or predictive of economic opportunity in adult life. One more illustration of kind of the old approach, but beginning to get into the newer approach. And so this is Eric Klinkenberg. He's actually another NYU professor. NYU is really pioneering this field of social geography. He is a sociologist by training. And the book I want to focus on is Heatwave, but he's also got a more recent book, Palaces for the People, that I'll mention in a moment. And so Heatwave is looking at a very relevant today, of course, 1995 heat wave in Chicago, Illinois. And you may remember this, thousands of people actually died, right? Chicago was not really prepared for it. It doesn't get quite as hot as it got in this heat wave. And so a lot of people did not have air conditioning. And what is described in Klinkenberg's study is the way in which different neighborhoods with very similar geographic, very similar climatic, and very similar social features. Basically, they look the same, had very different levels of fatality. And so part of his claim here is that the neighborhoods with good, intact social networks, where people basically knew there's an elderly woman living on the fourth floor walk up in that brownstone over there, and it's a severe heat wave. Maybe we should go look in on her, right? The social network is not just a Facebook connection. It is, in the context of a neighborhood, a solid, meaningful social institution that connects people with each other and forms pathways of mutual aid and assistance. And so in Chicago, people did well when they were actually connected via dense, trusting, functional social networks. And conversely, the places that had the highest concentration of fatalities were the places with the weakest social networks. And then Kunenberg identified, and this is what I think is really valuable in his study, the institutions that help to build intact, functional, strong, connective, supportive social networks. One of those, he argued, was the quality and availability of public spaces, libraries, parks, recreation centers, schools that aren't just places where the kids go, but where the neighborhood congregates. I was last week in Richmond, California, in the Soulful Softball annual tournament. This is a tournament in which community-based organizations organize softball teams and play each other. And they have a tournament, and they have a lot of big trophies that they get. But more importantly, it's an institution for bringing people who work with community-based organizations into contact with the rest of the community. And it was a wonderful and very illuminating gathering to see public space working. And by the way, Richmond just got a lot of money from the state of California to rehabilitate its recreational facilities. And so this new softball field was where this gathering took place. Similarly, and this is closely related, neighborhood activists build neighborhood networks and the social capital that accrues to those networks, trust and knowledge and acquaintance and intelligibility and the ability to come together and cooperate. And so another big factor here is, are there community-based organizations that are not top down, but laterally or horizontally organized, that connect people with each other, not just the social worker for the city providing you services. Often that's very valuable, but in a crisis like a heat wave, they're stretched thin. Are there also churches? Are there also political movements or support networks or job placement networks that connect people to each other? A fourth factor, and now moving into the way neighborhood networks contribute to economic opportunity, is peer socialization in early childhood. And I want to be as clear as possible. We're going to look in the second half at the moving to opportunity studies. These studies basically find, if you move by 5 years old to a neighborhood with greater economic opportunity, that has the strongest lifelong impacts. If you wait until the child is 13 years old to move, it no longer has positive impacts. So, right, early childhood exposure to networks, peer networks, other kids who have values that contribute to economic opportunity. The label here tends to be strivers. And the contrasting term from Jay McCoyd is leveled aspirations. His book, Ain't No Making It, looked at Boston public housing projects and the way in which the kids in the housing projects, by the time they were 6, 7, 10 years old, basically thought there's no need to concentrate on doing well in school, because nobody I know has advanced economically or socially through education. That's just a sucker's game, right? And so if your friends are telling you that, if their parents' experiences reinforce that lesson, then the lesson you internalize from a very young age is what McCoyd calls leveled aspirations, no chance of advancing yourself. And that becomes, of course, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Urban social resource deserts, places where there aren't churches or community-based organizations or a basic sense of security and cooperation, how likely is it that you will knock on a neighbor's door when you notice maybe that they left their key in their car, right? Um, that there are neighborhoods where you just don't do that. It's understood that could be an infringement on privacy or even dangerous. And so these are neighborhoods that produce and reinforce social isolation as opposed to social networks. Finally, there are also pathological social networks. And here I think you can think of gangs as being the most important example of this, networks that either produce leveled aspirations or that participate in organized crime and violence, and then again tend to make people in the neighborhood more isolated, less trusting, less cooperative. All right, finally, let's get to the new research. And this is where I really want to concentrate for the remainder of today. This is Raj Chetty, and he has been doing path breaking research at the University of Chicago and Stanford, and now at Harvard since he was in his early 30s. He's like Thomas Piketty, he's just got a tremendous understanding of how to work with the new big data that our new technological environment creates for us, right? And he's especially working with income data, and unlike Piketty, doing it in a way that's very sensitive to geography. And I guess I'll just say big data in the right hands is a powerful tool. And so in his Opportunity Insights Lab that he's organized at Harvard and now has a large number of economists working with it, he has produced what he's called an opportunity atlas. And so I want to start with the way in which this atlas works. He's taken the smallest unit of data collection at the national level, which is the census tract. And so to be right clear, over 70,000 census tracts in the United States. Census tracts contain about 4,200 people in them. And so he's used that level of analysis and the availability via public tax records of economic information on track by track level and produced a map of the United States divided into 70,000 tracks to look at trends in economic opportunity. This was a collaborative effort with the US Census Bureau, and it's produced these very detailed maps. I'll show you in just a moment. And this is then a new aspect of these recent developments in the study of economic inequality, the use of tax and big data to really figure out how much opportunity there is and what contributes to it. And he's focusing in particular on intergenerational transmission of opportunity for income. And someone like Piketty would say, and I think he'd be right to say, that's just one and perhaps not the most important variable. Perhaps the most important variable is, in fact, transmission of wealth, not income, not what you make this year, but what you own and how much it's worth and how much of it you therefore are able to pass down to the next generation, not only as a bequeathment or inheritance, but also just in terms of the security you provide for your children while they're growing up, the access to school and neighborhood, et cetera. And I think that's fair to say, but I think what Chetty is doing is also extremely valuable. And so let me then talk about some of the findings here. The first one that I think is really stunning, and I'll get to the details in just a moment, is how much the small neighborhood matters, right? So someone like Richard Florida asks us to think at the level of the city. Chetty is saying Let's think at the level of the neighborhood, and let's think about the neighborhood as a few square blocks, not even, right, the traditional designation that might be part of people's mental maps of the city. Let's look block by block, few blocks by few blocks, and we will see really important differences. And then an indication of why neighborhoods matter in terms of these social networks of support. And though other thinkers, Klinenberg, etc., can document them in times of crises, Chetty shows how they matter on a daily basis for the economic mindset and the economic opportunity of the children growing up on this block as opposed to that block. And this is strongly connected to the idea of having diverse or heterogeneous economic networks. That if you are connected to people who are middle class or upper middle class, when you yourself are relatively poor, that has a lifelong impact on your earnings. Many of these kids who are in these economically diverse neighborhoods earn hundreds of thousands of dollars more across their lifetime, tens of thousands more on an annual basis. And Chetty argues that it's really the neighborhood that matters much more than the wealth, the race, the education, or the other metrics of social difference of the parents. So this is then an overview of the outcomes of this project, right? And so you can see the United States broken down into smaller regions, and the color represents the likelihood that the children will have greater opportunity than the parents, right? And so that gives you a quick sense of the geography of mobility in the United States. And I want to immediately emphasize, look at how little economic opportunity there is in the Bible Belt. Look at how much more there is in the Midwest. And this is a social problem that is just so glaring. It just cries out for effective policy, and you can just see it as soon as you look at this map. But let's drill down. I decided to look in a little bit more detail at Richmond and El Cerrito, where I went to high school. I went to high school in Richmond, California. I lived in El Cerrito, California. And as you can see, right, Richmond is an area that has concentrated economic disadvantage, but also internal differences, right? And so North Richmond has much higher concentrations of economic disadvantage. And then there are some areas in East Richmond that actually have greater economic opportunity. And here again, right, these areas are separated by in places hundreds of yards from each other. But look at the difference between El Cerrito and Richmond, right? And again, uh, something that just cries out for explanation and attention. Let me give you a further then even more minute illustration. This is Los Angeles. And so these are two areas in Los Angeles, Watts and Compton, right? And by the way, we tend to think of Compton as it's represented in popular culture as an area of high crime, drugs, gangs, etc. But it turns out that that's not actually terribly accurate, at least if we look at the share of Black men incarcerated, right? 6.2% in Compton. You go half a mile away to Watts, very similar social factors, right? Same concentration in terms of race, very similar concentration of poverty, um, yet the rate of incarceration in Watts is 44% of Black men, right? So 8 times as high as the concentration in the very similar neighborhood, very close by. Clearly, something is differentiating these neighborhoods, and um, Chetty thinks he can help us to see it. So, again, just looking at the overall map, um, and this is an intergenerational map again. How likely is it that your children will earn more than you earn or less than you earn? And again, I think this very high concentration in the Bible Belt moving into the Atlantic seaboard of areas where there is downward mobility across generations is something that calls out for policy intervention. So then to understand the policy implications of these studies, I want to talk quickly about the short-term idea of what Chetty and his colleagues call moving to opportunity, which actually is the title of a study that was done about 20 years ago, looking at children who were given access, their parents were given access to housing vouchers or public housing that got them out of areas with high concentration of poverties into mixed income areas. That's the study that shows if you move by the time your child is 5 or younger than 5, this has a lifelong impact. Whereas if you wait until they're 13, it doesn't have that effect. What Chetty is able to do is to trace movements not by looking at individual families, but by looking at overall social data, in part to also model what would happen if people move. And so, right, this is the data that shows if you move young, it has a very strong determinant effect on the outcome for children. If you wait until later, the effect is minimal. And then the impact of moving, right? And it varies with cities, but as you can see, right, that the income of the people who stayed in place when compared with the income of the people who moved, it's nearly double the income for the grown children. They measure income at age 30 compared with the people who didn't move. And this suggests to Chetty that what we need to start doing is identifying what he calls bargain opportunity neighborhoods. This shows you the move to opportunity, where people moved from and to in Chicago, right? And moving very short distances, less than a mile, nevertheless creates these opportunities. And so lifetime gains in income can be a couple $100,000 or more. Being able to do this relies on being able to find affordable housing in the high opportunity neighborhoods. And one question is, are there these bargain neighborhoods? And if so, what accounts for the bargain neighborhoods? So going back then, right, what the short-term goal is and what Chetty believes he can already do is identify opportunity bargains, places where poor people could move to get greater economic opportunities and to start encouraging people to move there. But long term, the goal, and I think this is the really central point, has to be equalizing opportunity across neighborhoods. There's really no reason that the United States should look like such a patchwork of opportunity, and that a whole large geographic areas should be concentrated areas of stalled or downward mobility, right? And so that involves taking a whole neighborhood approach to policy reform. Don't concentrate on individuals, don't concentrate just on schools, concentrate on the neighborhood as a whole, creating public space, creating affordable housing, creating social entrepreneurs and social networks. And so, if this is correct, there are two things that should be done. The first is removing impediments to people moving to opportunity. Zoning and land use regulation, moving from not in my backyard to yes in my backyard, which is a movement in urban America today, is extremely important. And we're going to have to probably change structures of local government to give less veto power to the currently affluent who use the current land use and environmental impact processes to slow down, stall, or prevent affordable housing developments in their neighborhood. We have to subsidize the construction of affordable mixed income housing in the area where the opportunity is, in addition to building out public transportation. So if you can't live in San Francisco, you can take an affordable, high speed train from Fresno or Stockton to get there and get to where the jobs are. Reforming low opportunity neighborhoods. And this is the harder, more difficult project, but it's absolutely essential. Creating public space, encouraging positive neighborhood network formation through education, but also through subsidizing the people who do this hard work, and breaking down artificial barriers to inclusive and diverse neighborhood formation. Some of these barriers are physical, where the highways are placed, but some of them are jurisdictional, right? Where are the school district lines? We need to be thinking about integrating our neighborhoods economically, because clearly that is a central dimension to economic opportunity in the 21st century. All right, so I hope that was an interesting update on this research and a good indication of maybe where some of the infrastructure money that's now being spent should be going. Happy to take questions. I do have to say I have a 12 o'clock appointment today that I can't be late for, so I'm going to limit it to about 10 minutes. But who wants to start us out?
Well, see,
Go ahead.
I'm thinking of what happened to Berkeley, California after World War II, where kids came from all over the world, the veterans, and they lived in cars and they went to school. But the university quickly developed the Cardenistas village for them. So we have a different kind of movement now that we need. We don't have wars moving large populations of men who survived and who wanted to continue their education. We have to make schools available, and next to the schools, homes available. How are we going to do that with so many other things? I don't know. But
Yeah,
in the homes, there must be schools. And then the schools make the next step possible.
thank you, Flossie. And by the way, I'm just gonna note that you were very fast on getting yourself unmuted today. That's good. Yes. So 1950s America, I think, is really a very good illustration of how to do this well, right? Or how well the United States can do this. And I just think we have to have a balance here. So one thing in 1950s America, whether it's the legislation creating benefits for enlisted men, right, the GI Bill, and the opportunity for education with the vast expansion of the university system, or the very rapid construction of homes and the spread of home ownership in the suburbs, we streamlined licensing. And one way to put this is we were more focused on the supply side than the demand side, not just giving people vouchers to get housing, but actually building the housing, right? And so I think there is movement in this direction, at least within the Democratic Party right now, maybe especially in California. And so I think there's some positive signs, but yes, I do think pointing to the middle of the 20th century as a period when we did this better is a really good way to be thinking about this. All right, I couldn't tell. Marion, were you waving at Barbara or were you trying to get my attention?
Yes.
Okay, I think you guys must have been waving at each other. Anybody else with a question? John, go ahead. I see you had your hand up. Oh, and I also have somebody called PDP's iPhone. Who is that? Oh, okay, that's David, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that educational economists have been doing the same kind of geographic analysis that you're talking about. And if you take, if you use educational achievement rather than income distribution or inequity as the outcome measures, you get the same set of factors accounting for, achievement differential across neighborhoods. And they've gotten down to the same level of specificity, where they can do school by school analysis and even sub neighborhoods within school attendance areas.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And of course, one of those things that peers do, and I mentioned Jay McLeod's Ain't No Making It, that they actually socialize each other about attitudes to education, right? And so absolutely, yes. And obviously, right, one of the reasons to try to create more economically integrated neighborhoods in the knowledge economy is because they will have both the peer networks and the resources for school and education. And I think you're absolutely right, David, that in this knowledge economy, the number one path to economic opportunity is education. And in particular, whereas it used to be a high school education, it is absolutely essential today to have a college education.
Yeah, right.
All the deaths of despair literature shows there are huge disparities in outcomes for people with and without college education. Go ahead, David.
But as a long-term educator, I would be the first to say that education can't do it on its own. If we don't have the economic supports, and if we don't have the services into of healthcare, equity of food, equality of income, we're still going to have these dramatic differentials.
Yes, and that's, I think, one of the fundamental takeaways of this literature is you can't focus on a single dimension of policy reform. As important as education is, you need an integrated neighborhood approach, right? And so yes, schools, but also public space, but also affordable housing, also transportation, also encouraging social network formation by subsidizing and educating and facilitating social entrepreneurs doing community-based organizing. You got to do it all at the same time. And that comes back then, in a sense, to Flossie's remark, which is to do it in the 21st century, we need to remember what we did in the 20th century, but we need a much more holistic or integrated approach as well. Marion, are you raising your hand?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to say that there's an awfully important component that you didn't discuss, which is individual people's taking advantage of the social network of their neighborhood. In my neighborhood, when my kids were growing up, there was a playground, which was a source of intercommunication between people. When they needed help, if one kid was sick and they needed attention to the other kid, somebody would take over. They grew comfortable, and it had to be done by individual scheduling. If you weren't out when the other kids were out, which was a problem for me, I used to get finished with doing all the housework at 5 o'clock and get to the playground. And my daughter complained that we were not taking advantage of the neighborhood socialization because everybody else had gone out for dinner. So we changed our schedule and came back later. There was also a huge difference 2 blocks away from where we were. People were not sharing babysitting and community help with each other because they didn't trust their neighbors. They hadn't spent time sitting together in the playground. So it took individual organization and individual urgency to take advantage of the social components that were available.
Yeah, and I'll point out, Marion, that Robert Putnam's Our Kids definitely reinforces what you're saying, and he uses even more extreme examples. For instance, when it comes to drug addiction, that a neighborhood with a strong social network and therefore good informal mechanisms for finding help, very often the children recover very quickly, right? Because they're able to find their way to a social worker, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. Their peers support them, the parents, the friends support them, and they're able to cushion the crisis as it occurs and do better as a result. And so yes, that matters hugely. And yes, so you have to be able to take advantage of this, but in a sense, I think this literature suggests that's just the value of the network. As I said a few minutes ago, I do have an appointment, so I do have to go in order to not be late. Wonderful as always being with you guys. Please be well, stay cool, hydrate, take care, and I will see you all next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
David.
Bye, guys.